my colleague Louise Singleton will be going through HNES and just a general introduction. Then Sam Hales will be going through the application process, then handing back to Louise to look at the assessment process. Then it's back to me for the pre-application support available, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, then Louise, I'll hand over to you.
Fab, thank you, Christina. Hi everyone, so I'm Louise Singleton. I'm the Programme Manager at GemServe for the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. And I'm just going to give you an overview as to what the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme is and why it is here. So yeah, if you can go to the next slide. So so as I said, I work for GemServe. We are responsible for the overall scheme delivery of HNES. We've been appointed by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And we're working with a couple of other companies as well as part of the delivery partner. So we have Rambol, who are our technical assessors. And so they are responsible for reviewing the applications that we receive and determining whether or not they should be recommended for funding to the department. And we work with them in the demonstrator scheme that ran from October 2021 for about 6 to 9 months. And then we also have Turner and Townsend, who are providing pre-application support and an engagement. So if you are looking to submit an application form and you would like someone to speak to someone specifically about your project, if you have really specific questions that only really relate to your project, then you can request a relationship manager, and Turner and Townsend can provide that support. And we also have LuxNova, who are there to provide legal advice, for example, around grant funding agreements and things like that. So, so they're kind of 2 new additions to the scheme. If you go to the next slide. So there are 3 aims and objectives of HNES. The first one is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. The second is to reduce customer detriment. And the third one is to help the market prepare for sector regulation. So, so the whole purpose of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme is we're aware that there are a number of heat networks that are out there. Heat networks are not a new technology in this country. They've been here since the 70s. And there are some heat networks out there that are not operating as efficiently as they could do. And so the purpose of the scheme is to provide some grant funding to help existing heat networks to improve their performance. Obviously, from one hand, to reduce carbon emissions, on the other hand, to improve the experience that customers have when it comes to being a heat network customer. Both of those together are really useful in helping the government to achieve their net zero 2050 targets, because obviously if we're reducing carbon emissions, then that's great anyway, but improving customer experience and consumer confidence in heat networks will really help the kind of the rhetoric around expanding the use of heat networks over the next 30 years, 35 or 25 years to make our heat in the UK more energy efficient. And on the third point around sector regulation, so the sector will become regulated over the next year or so, and technical standards will be brought in to bring up the level of efficiency of these heat networks. So this is kind of a bit of a step before that to help some of the really poorly performing heat networks improve and be able to meet those technical standards that are going to be coming down the line. So in terms of funding, we have 2 pots. We have a capital pot and a revenue pot. On the capital side, that is for actually installing measures that will help to improve the efficiency of the heat network. So this is part funded. So we will be able to provide you up to, but not including, 50% of the total cost of your project. And then the rest has to be provided by yourselves as the heat network operators or owners. And the budget pot for this is up to 30 million across this financial year and next financial year. And then we have revenue grants, which are basically there for heat networks that know that they're not performing particularly efficiently, but they don't know why. So these are fully funded, and they basically pay for a third-party consultant to come in and have a look at the heat network and understand the areas where it's not performing very well, and provide you with an optimization study, which will identify where people can what measures can be done to improve the heat network. And this pot is much smaller. It's only 2 million across the 2 financial years. So there are a couple of points at the bottom here that's worth noting. So it's possible to apply for funding across both financial years, but if you're allocated funding in this financial year, you have to have spent it by the end of this financial year, so the end of March 2024. And then if you've awarded funding for next financial year, you can't start spending it until the 1st of April, or you can't claim it, sorry, until the 1st of April, until the end of March 2025. On the capital side of things, it doesn't necessarily have to be a 50-50 split between the match funding and the partial and your grant funding across the 2 financial years. So, for example, if you were looking to apply in round 4, which is our next funding round, and you were looking to install, like buy some new kit, like some new pipes or some insulation or something, and you wanted to use your grant funding in this financial year to buy the pipes, for example, you could do that, and then the rest of the project costs could be spent in the next financial year with your match funding to actually install and actually commission that piece of kit that you've got. So it doesn't have to be exactly 50-50 match the whole way through the scheme or through your project. It's only right at the end that we need to make sure that you have spent more than the grant in terms of that 50-50 split. And then finally, it's just worth saying that for the revenue grants, we're now about to start entering into our 4th funding round, and actually the funding that was available for revenue grants in this financial year has now all been allocated in the first 3 rounds. So there is no more revenue funding available for this financial year 23-24. However, if you're applying in round 4, you can still apply for a revenue grant. We would just ask you to sort of in your application form say that you only want the funding in 24-25. It also doesn't mean you can't start your project until the 1st of April. It just means you can't draw down your funding until the 1st of April 2024. So for example, so in round 4, you will probably find out if you've been successful around sort of January time. So you could start your optimization study, say mid-January. Typically they last about 3 to 4 months. And so you would complete your study, say in April, and at that point you could then submit your grant claim form and claim your grant for your revenue study. So it shouldn't really delay projects that much anyway, based on the timeframes that it takes to complete an optimization study. So, but it's just worth noting that if you are submitting in round 4 and you request revenue grants for 23-24, we won't be able to award that because we don't. The funding's all been used up for this financial year. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So, in terms of who can apply, we need to have the applicant being the operator or the owner of an existing heat network or a communal heating system, or it can be cooling as well. Heating or cooling is supported. So yes, we're looking at district heating or communal heating. The heat networks must be situated in England or Wales. We don't cover Scotland, but yeah, England or Wales is fine. And we accept applications from all types of organisations, so public sector, private sector, third sector, hospitals, universities, all sorts of organisations are able to apply. And ultimately, the applicant must be the authority that can sign off on investment decisions. So if you're a consultant who runs a heat network, depending on what your agreement is with the owner, if you are able to make investment decisions on that heat network, then you could apply. Otherwise, we would need the owner of the heat network to apply, because they're the ones that are going to be signing the contracts and particularly on a capital side of things are going to be responsible for the match funding part of it as well. So we want to make sure that they're aware of that and they have the match funding in place as well. Okay, so as I said, we've already had our first 3 funding rounds. There are 8 funding rounds in total. Our next funding round closes on the 22nd of September. So those of you that may have attended these before or been aware of HNES before may notice that that's actually been pushed back. The original date for round 4 was the 25th of August, but with it being the bank holiday weekend and August being most people were away, I think we figured it would be better for applicants to delay the closing date. So yeah, so we're now looking at Friday the 22nd of September for round 4, and we've also then shifted round 5 back as well to the 10th of November now. So so if you are looking at those 2 funding rounds, just keep those new dates in your head. And then there's a bit of a gap kind of over Christmas, and then the next funding round after that is 2nd of February, and then we've got one in March and one in May. Okay, so in terms of what's actually eligible for the two funding pots, we've got, so for capital grants, we're able to fund works across the whole range of the heat network. So starting at the energy centre, through the primary and secondary network, tertiary network, and also some metering as well. There are some costs that aren't eligible. I should say we have a document, which is our guidance for applicants document, which is available on our website, and I think Christina will put a link to it in the chat as well. This will go into a lot more detail around what is eligible and not eligible. So please read that if you are looking to submit an application. But in terms of just high level, what's ineligible, if you've done any work already before we've awarded your HNES grant, that won't be eligible because that's already happened. Anything that's not related to the heat network infrastructure itself, so improving your building fabric, that wouldn't be included. This is solely looking at the heat network itself. Anything relating to engagement activities or stakeholder management, that wouldn't be covered. And then specifically looking at the energy centre, we are not able to offer grants for replacing your primary heat source. So that's mainly because the Green Heat Network Fund exists as well for heat networks in England. So, and that's there to support the new heat generation going in, and equally from a carbon perspective, we want to make sure that we're not necessarily paying for like replacements, for example, for a gas boiler, so which would then obviously have a longer lifetime as well. So yeah, we're not replacing primary heat source. For tertiary systems, we're not replacing radiators or things like that within buildings. And finally, on the metering side, if there is anything that's a legal requirement under the heat network metering and billing requirements, then that wouldn't be covered because obviously that's a legal requirement that you have to meet anyway. Anything that goes kind of over and above the requirements within that those rules, we may be able to fund. So so yeah, as long as it's not what's already required legally, then we might be able to fund that as well. From a revenue perspective, if we go to the next slide, so the revenue grants are there to pay for an optimization study. It needs to be done by a third party organisation. It can't be done in-house. We want someone independent to come in and have a look at the heat network. Within the guidance for applicants documents, there is a specification as to what we would expect to see from an optimization study, and I'll talk you through a little bit more in the next few slides about that. So again, have a look at that if you're looking to apply for a revenue grant. Again, if you've already incurred some or undertaken some work before your before the application, that wouldn't be covered. Any project management of your consultant wouldn't be covered, and any construction, operation and maintenance wouldn't be covered as well. mainly because some of that will be under capital grants, and it should be kind of ongoing work. So it's just looking at how is the network performing now, and what potential measures could be installed to improve it. Okay, so talking through very high level what an optimization study would cover, we have 2 work packages. The first one is essentially involves a consultant coming on site. That's a key part of it. We do want them to actually have been and physically seen the heat network. It can't just be a desk-based study. And it's to identify the baseline performance of the heat network. So how is it currently operating? How much electricity is it using? Gas is it using? Carbon emissions is it producing? How much are you charging your customers? Where are the areas of suboptimal performance? So yeah, what isn't working well, and what is the impact that that's having on the network and customers as well? So like I say, there needs to be a site visit, capturing some data, analysing any data if you do have it. We're conscious that partly why some of these networks are performing poorly is because people don't have the data. So you're not necessarily penalised if you don't have data, but from an optimization study, it's useful for the consultant to have any information that you do have. And then they produce a baseline of how your heat network is currently performing. And then the second work package is then, if you go to the next slide, is then actually looking at what are the opportunities to improve that performance. So what measures could be installed? How much would they cost? What impact would they have in terms of reducing energy use, reducing flow temperatures, return temperatures, any sort of areas of subperformance? And ultimately, what you'll get at the end of that then is a what we call a techno-economic analysis, which is a real identifying of potential measures or packages of measures that could work for your heat network, how much they would cost, how much they would then save, and so you've got all the information you ideally need to be able to take to someone to get an investment decision to then implement the recommendations in the report. So it's not just a report, it does have the sort of Excel spreadsheet that sits behind it and all the workings behind it as well. So you can sort of fiddle around with the payback times and all that kind of stuff. So you've got a really useful data set to be able to then go and ideally implement some of the opportunities in the report. If we go to the next one. So yeah, so this is just a summary of what you would have. So you'd have your report, you'd have a summary of the site visit that they've undertaken, the spreadsheet that I said, the technico-economic spreadsheet, and then as part of your contract, if you're successful, you have to complete some monitoring and reporting submissions every month, so we can see that your project is on track to deliver. And there is a particular spreadsheet, a particular worksheet in that spreadsheet called the Optimization Study Outputs Annex, which basically is a summary of your report in Excel form that the department can then use to sort of collate across all the revenue projects and get an idea of the type of measures that are being recommended across all heat networks and things like that. And then an optional thing at the end is then to actually take your revenue study and then apply for a capital grant off of the back of the recommendations that are made. So obviously that's not always going to be the case, but yeah, that is also then available to you as well. So just a couple of examples. I mentioned the demonstrator before. So these are a couple of projects that were undertaken. They got funding in January 2022. So they've now had time to kind of go through and implement. So the first one on the left, the Hackney Council one, was for an optimization study. So they had 2 optimization studies for 2 of their heat networks. And they appointed an organisation called Chirpy Heat, who went out and visited the 2 sites. They identified 18 different measures that could be introduced. And based on those, they could save around £3,000, reduce carbon emissions by 676 tonnes over a 20-year period. So yeah, so there were some good savings identified. So the council is now looking to implement those measures that have been identified and take those forward. And then on the right-hand side, we've got Notting Hill Genesis, who are a housing association, and they received just over £300,000 for their Mildmay heat network. And that was predominantly looking at HIUs, so heat interface units. The performance there was really poor. They had poor water quality, and their controls weren't very good. So the funding they received allowed them to make changes to the system. So they then had better flow and return temperatures, reduced their gas consumption by 32%, and they were then able to pass on the savings that they made in terms of energy onto their residents, and were able to lower their bills and also reduce their carbon emissions. So another requirement of the scheme is if you are successful, we will be producing case studies of all the projects that have got funding, so that we can then share that more widely with the industry, and people can kind of see what issues heat networks are facing and the type of measures that were implemented to make those savings, and the type of savings that people were able to achieve as well. So it gives a bit more information to the market to hopefully help other heat networks that maybe aren't performing as well to understand what they could maybe do as well. Right, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sam now to talk about the application process.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Louise.
Christina.
I was going to say, as Christina said, we'll pick up all the questions at the end. So I haven't answered any as we've gone through, but we'll answer those at the end. So in terms of the application process, as Louise said, I'm Sam, the sort of application support and relationship management lead. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the application forms. They are in an Excel format, and there are two different types. There's a capital and a revenue application form. So please make sure when you're completing them, you complete the correct form for the application type that you'd like to complete. There is also in the forms an application status tab, and you're therefore able to see the incomplete sort of marker or complete markers in there to make sure you're going through and doing every box that's needed. We have got it later in the slides, but the current versions, please make sure you use the current versions when you come to submit your applications. We have got it written later on in the presentation, but the current versions are version 4 for the capital application forms and version 2 for the revenue. If you're not sure if you've got the right form, please just email us and we're able to provide the latest one for you. So going into each tab on the application form, they're broken down into lettered tabs. So tab A, the applicant info, is fairly self-explanatory. It's all the information around your organisation as the applicant. We need you to make sure that the applicant name matches the legal entity name of your organisation. So for instance, on Companies House, it needs to be that full name. It can't be any shorter names, trading names. We need the full company name. And then there is also a part in there which asks for a VAT number. If your organisation has one, please make sure you include it. Otherwise, it will be one of our first clarification questions coming back to you. So please make sure it is included when you submit the form. Moving on to tab B. This is all about your project information. So description of the network, it'll ask for the address of the network, the characteristics, or it'll also ask about customers in need, and all the other regulatory questions such as heat trust registration or the heat network metering and billing regulations sort of questions. So all those sort of ones are covered in that tab B. It's all about the network that you're applying for in that application. And then moving on to tab C, the project narrative. So this is your opportunity to tell us about your heat network. There's a lot more free text in these fields. So it is worth trying to put in as much detail as you can into these project narrative ones. They are reviewed by the assessors. They are marked by the assessors. So the more detail you can put in there, the better. And as I say, they're sort of free text, so you can give the overview of the project that you want to do and funding requests. There's stuff around the network data availability. As you can see, it's all sort of listed here around the different objectives of the HNES scheme. And then also being able to share the information across various or your organisation in particular, and anywhere else that you'd like to share the information. And then the sort of outcomes suboptimal outcomes. So they are ones that are worth just trying to detail as much as you can. They are fully read, those sections, and they are free text boxes in tab C. If we move on to tab D, these are your baseline and targets. So these are particularly important, like for capital projects. So these are the baselines of what your heat network is currently performing to, and then the targets that, as a capital project, you'd like to meet. So it could well be reducing the amount of imported fuel or things like that. We need to see your targets for any measures that you are wanting. So if you're wanting to reduce the imported fuel, we need to see that baseline, we need to see that target. You don't have to fill out every single box if you don't have the information. The more information you have, the better. We're aware, obviously, some of the poorly performing networks might be poorly performing because people don't know where it's, don't have all the data, but the more you can put in this tab, the better for the assessment. We won't mark people down for not necessarily having the information, but it is definitely in your benefit to put as much as you can in. And yeah, any ones where you want to improve, we have to have a target against it. If we move on to tab E, the funding and procurement, if you are requesting irrecoverable VAT, please make sure you put a justification into why it's being claimed. So there is a box for your grant ask and a box for any irrecoverable VAT. Please make sure you detail those out in there, and then also explain why. There is a bit further down where you're able to explain it. Just explain why you need to claim the irrecoverable VAT. It is something that's allowed, but we need the justification as to why for your organisation you need that. And then if you're wanting to put any contingency in, so this is more looking at sort of capital projects in particular, if you want to put any contingency allowances in, please make sure it's broken out. There is another section, please put it in that section, break it out, and clearly identify it so that we're able to see it and make sure it's proportionate to your project. Please don't just embed it in the other costs, because we will come back and ask, why do your costs look higher than we're expecting? So yeah, please break it out in tab E. The final tab is tab F, the confirmations. So there are a set of confirmations that you need to say you've read and understood, that you'll abide by the scheme rules and all the various sort of monitoring reporting requirements, and as Louise said, the case study requirements earlier. It will also ask about supporting evidence that you've uploaded it all. Please make sure you do upload supporting evidence. We will come on to what's needed. The greater the detail of supporting evidence, the better. So it's anything, the more you can break your supporting evidence down into the various costs or project plans, the more you can break that down, the better. For, again, the assessors will review all the supporting evidence. So please do just make sure that you break it down, or you make it as detailed as possible for us. So the supporting evidence, we have them for both capital and revenue here listed. They are all in the application guidance that we were talking about earlier, and Christina posted a link for earlier. But just to go through a few of the key ones. So for the capital grants, evidence of the costs is definitely needed. So quotes, things like that are definitely needed. And then evidence of the targeted benefits. So evidence of those targets that you're going to try and reach and why they are as they are. They can't just be numbers just plucked from thin air. So it is some evidence to show how you got to those targets is brilliant. And then you'll need the signed letters confirming all the bullet points there, which are part of the confirmations. So around the support for the works being carried out, the match funding, the signing up to the monitoring and reporting requirements, and the other confirmations that are needed. So that is all listed in the application format in that tab F, but that is what those letters are for. We need the summary of the programmer works. So that, yeah, again, the more detail you can put in that summary, the better. and then confirmations around the all the other bits around metering costs, around the heat network metering and billing regulations. So moving on to sort of the revenue one, there's a little bit less because it's a different grant, but again, we need evidence of the costs, so quotes of the costs of the works. We need the confirmation letters again. So again, it's very, very similar. The applicant support, the support for the application, the match funding, if relevant. So there, as Louise was saying earlier, the revenue grants can be 100% funded, but some people may choose to fund part of the revenue study, especially if it's a larger one. So if there is any match funding, that needs to be part of that. And then acceptance and monitoring reporting requirements and the confirmation of any other subsidies relevant to the project and the project programme. So very, very similar things there that need to be covered. And then if we move on to the next slide. Sorry, just moving on. Yeah, so with in terms of multiple projects, we do not as HNES intend to fund multiple projects by the same applicant where they're considered similar in terms of engineering, design or operation. So we are looking, if you're applying for a grant, we're looking for you to try and take those learnings and apply them into the rest of your heat network portfolio. So the idea is that you're not just applying for exactly the same again and again and again. So that is particularly important for the revenue studies. And then, as it says in the second point, applicants should consider the extent to which learnings from a smaller number of the studies may support other works within the budget envelope. So again, just trying to ensure that any learnings are learnt from one heat network and are applied across the whole portfolio that you have. So to submit an application, you'd need to email us at hnes@gemserv.com to request an application form. So as I said earlier, the current application forms are version 4 for the capital and version 2 for the revenue application forms. If you can express interest in applying in future rounds, that would be brilliant, even if you aren't 100% sure exactly what round you are going to apply in. If you have a rough idea of when you are looking to apply, if you're able to email us, express that interest, that then means we're able to ensure that we make contact and put you in touch if you would like a relationship manager before the round closes. We can try and support you, and it means that we're able to see it going forwards when we're likely to get peaks in applications. And then requesting a SharePoint space. So all applications need to be submitted via SharePoint. We provide a SharePoint space for you to upload your evidence and your application into. So if you, again, email our inbox, say you'd like to submit an application for round 4, we are then able to ask for a few details, set the space up, and we'll provide you with a link so that you are able to apply. Please make sure you've emailed and requested that SharePoint space at least a week before the deadline. The sooner you do it, the better, but definitely a week before the deadline to submit an application. That then means that we are able to ensure that we've got the space set up and that you've got access to it prior to needing to submit the applications. There's no last minute issues with it. So I will pass back to Louise for the assessment process.
Fabulous, thank you. I have actually been answering some of the questions in the chat as we've been going through, just in case we run out of time at the end, but I'll also talk them through if we do have time. But yeah, if you do have any further questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll try and answer them. So yeah, so onto the assessment process. So this is obviously what happens once you've submitted your application and how are we actually then reviewing the applications that we receive. So if we go to the next slide. So for capital applications, there are 5 scoring criteria. The first 2 are listed here. So deliverability. So we're looking at the cost certainty and the delivery certainty of the project. So as part of your application, you have to tell us how much you think the project's going to cost. So we're looking at whether we think that's realistic. Are you asking for too much money? Are you asking for not enough money? Do we think you can actually deliver for the costs that you've put forward? And then on the delivery side of things, we also ask around project timescales. So we ask for a project plan, and we want to understand, again, are those timescales realistic? If you're asking for funding in this financial year, for example, do you think you'll actually be able to complete those elements by the end of March? Or do we not think that's realistic and therefore some of the funding might get lost? So those are the 2 areas we're looking at on deliverability. On network performance improvement, so we're looking at how the measures that you're planning to implement are going to improve the performance of your heat network. So are they reducing your cost of delivering heat to the end customer? Are they improving the efficiency of the heat network? Are they reducing outages or interruptions that weren't planned? Are you saving on electricity and gas? And also, we're also looking at the quality of the supporting information that you provide. So, so if you if, for example, you say we're going to implement this measure and we think it's going to save 10% on our gas savings, we don't really know why we think 10%. We're just kind of gone finger in the air. It's probably around that. That's probably going to score less well than someone that's had someone who's done some kind of calculations or has got some evidence base as to why they think that 10% is realistic or likely. Because one of the things that the department is really keen to understand from the scheme is the benefits that are achieved from the measures that we're installing. And so we're taking the information you put in your application form, and that essentially becomes the basis of what we're expecting to achieve from this scheme. So the more realistic and evidence-based those targets are, the better from our perspective. Again, as I said before, we appreciate that that's not always possible, and you won't be unable to apply if you don't have the information. It's just you may not score as well in this area as others that had better quality data. If you go to the next slide, there are 3 more. So we're looking at the project narrative. So that's basically how your project aligns with our objectives. So why does your project align with objective 1, or how does your project align with objective 1 around reducing carbon emissions? How does it align with objective 2 around reducing customer detriment? And I think one of the questions in the chat was if you're a single non-domestic, if you have a single non-domestic customer, are you ineligible to apply? No, you're not. You don't have to have, and actually going even further than that, you don't even have to have a customer. So for example, we've had hospitals apply, for example, who they don't necessarily have a customer because they are using the heat on the site. That is the use of the network. It's just that, again, you wouldn't score necessarily as well under objective 2 as another applicant who, for example, is a social housing provider and they've got, I don't know, 500 residents and they're all in sort of fuel poverty or low income. So you're not ineligible. You can definitely score well in other areas as well, but it's just that you wouldn't necessarily score so well in that regard. And the third part around project narrative is around this approach to disseminating information. So one of the key things that we're keen to achieve from HNES is a better understanding within the industry of how to improve heat networks, but also to help customers understand that their heat network has been improved as well. So we're looking at the approach to disseminating information within your own organization, and potentially if you've got a portfolio of heat networks, how are you going to share any information that you've got across other heat networks that could benefit from it? How are you going to share that information with your customers? And how are you potentially going to share that information with the the wider market to sort of, I guess, increase the value that this funding has secured. The fourth one is value for money. So this is very kind of, I guess, black and white. It's kind of the cost of carbon abated, cost of gas savings, cost of electricity savings. So, so yeah, depending on how much savings you're making, we're trying to work out. We're giving you X amount of money, you're saving this. So what's the value for money that we're achieving from funding this project? And finally, the last one here, data availability and baselining. So again, just looking at the information that you have available, any energy meter data that you might have, any operational data, and trying to understand the rationale for the baseline information that you provided to us. So how well do you know how that your heat network is performing or not? As I said before, if you don't have any data, you're not restricted from applying. We understand that actually some of these are the heat networks really want to help because that's why they don't know what why it's or how to improve it. So you wouldn't be penalised for not having it, but obviously the more data you have and you can share with us, then the better. So that's the 5 on capital. There are 3 on revenue. So again, very similar. So we're looking at the project narrative. How do you align with our objectives? How likely are you to deliver on your costs and your project plan? And what data do you have available? So those are the 3 for a revenue application that we would score against. In terms of timescales from when you apply, so for example, round 4, you submit on the 22nd of September. The first 6 weeks are the assessment process, and that includes a clarification period. So we may come back to you and ask for further information if we're not clear on what you've provided in your application. And at the end of that period, we then submit a report to what's called the investment committee. So that's within the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So we make a recommendation to them. They then review our recommendations and will then decide whether or not they agree with them or whether they want to, make the funding awards. So that takes a couple of weeks, and then there's a period of internal approvals. So it has to go to the minister to approve, because this is obviously quite a large grant. We will then, hopefully by week 11, be able to confirm to you whether or not you've been successful in getting funding. For non-local authority projects, at that point, we will then start putting together your grant funding agreement. So that's your legal contract, essentially, to say this is how much you've been awarded and these are conditions of funding. And then you'll have a couple of weeks to sign that document. If you're a local authority, then it does have to go through the Section 31 approvals process. So it can take a little bit longer to go through that before we then issue you with your memorandum of understanding for signing. So that can take anywhere between sort of 2 to 4 weeks to go through that process. So sometimes it just takes a little bit longer for local authority projects. In terms of clarifications, as I mentioned, it is essential that the applicant is available during this period. This sort of, I guess, it's mainly 2 to 4 weeks. That to enable us, if we do have any questions, that we're able to get a timely response. If you're not able to respond in that time, we just have to go on what we've got in front of us, which means you may not be. We may not have understood what you've written sufficiently, or we may not be able to award you as many points as we might do if you're able to answer the clarification questions. And it's also worth noting there might be further questions raised as part of the investment committee process as well. So it's important that within your application form, you're able to put down a primary and secondary contact. So ideally, one of you will be around during this period to be able to answer any questions in a timely fashion. Go to the next slide. So I touched on it briefly before. There is a requirement for monitoring and reporting if you're successful. And essentially, this allows us to understand if your project is on track and whether we're going to meet the aims of the scheme. So we have got further written guidance on how to complete your monitoring and reporting requirements, and that's provided to successful projects. But as a high-level overview, if you have a revenue project, you have to submit a return every month until your optimization study is complete and sent in to us for sign-off. And we're looking at any updates on how your project is progressing, any risks and issues, and when you're expecting to draw down your budget, so that we can make sure that we're ready to accept any grant claim forms that we have. And then the final return at the end of the project will also have this optimization study outputs annex that I spoke about, which is the summary. It should be filled in by your consultant of an sort of summarizing your optimization study for us. From a capital perspective, you are required to complete this on a monthly basis until 24 months after your commissioning date. This is to enable us to have 2 full years of data after the project has been completed, so that we're covering 2 heat cycles, so that we can see, or heat seasons, I should say, so that we can see that the benefits are being realised and are being maintained as well, and it's not just a kind of one-off. Again, on a monthly basis, we're looking for the same as for revenue, so updates on your project, risks and issues, and when you're expected to draw down your budget, and also when you're planning to spend your match funding. And then on a quarterly basis, we want you to provide some information about how you're progressing against the benefits that you identified in your application form. So when you complete your baseline and target section of your application form, we will then take that information from your application form and put it into your M&R return, and we want to then see, as your project progresses, how well you are on track to deliver what you said you wanted to achieve at the outset of your application. Okay, and that was all from me, so back to Christina.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Sam. So before we do get started on answering the questions that Louise hasn't already got round to answering, I'm just going to touch on the pre-application support available to you. So Sam touched on this, but if you are considering an application, please do just touch base with us and let us know. So our general inquiries email address is hnes@gemserve.com. That's for all general inquiries about the scheme as well. And then also, if you want to join the mailing list as well, to make sure that you're up to date with all the guidance materials, application seminar dates like this, and just general information, it's that email address there that you can reach us on. And on the right hand side, though, if you would like to discuss your actual application, you can be assigned a relationship manager to support you. So that email address is different. That's hnes.support@gemserve.com. And then I'll just refer again to the link that I shared earlier for the guidance document. Just touching on the pre-app support available. So once you are assigned a relationship manager, that will be your kind of point of contact throughout the process. So that will start off with an initial call, I think. So it's at 30 minutes to 45 minutes, just a general chat about your project. And then you will have one-to-ones with your relationship manager to discuss the application, and then there's also a first pass review, so that would be like feedback on your application. If anything isn't quite filled out right or anything like that, the support is there to help you. So yeah, the team will be able to give you feedback prior to submission, and then kind of pinpoint when you are ready to submit as well. And then I'll just leave you with the new social media accounts. We've just recently set up a HNES LinkedIn and Twitter page. So the handles are there if you'd like to give us a follow. That will also make sure that you're up to date with events and guidance materials as well. So thank you very much. I'm just going to flick back through the chat to see where the questions begin.
So the first question was from Thomas, which was just a sort of a more specific project question about his project. So yeah, Thomas, please get in touch with us if you want to speak specifically about that. That would be really interesting to hear. If a project does extend past the sort of 24-25 window, as I said, the funding does need to be spent by the end of 24-25. But and ideally, we want projects to be completing within that time period, particularly because we have sort of benefits targets that we kind of want to meet. And so obviously the earlier the projects complete, the better, to enable us to start realising the benefits as soon as possible. But yeah, it'd be useful to us to understand what your project is and whether we think that would be suitable. There's a question here from Paul from the Isle of Wight NHS Trust, where it says, do applicants have to meet all four criteria? I'm not entirely sure, Paul. I don't know if you're still on the call, if you're able to just, which 4 criteria do you mean? Are you talking about the energy centre and the primary network, secondary network element, or?
Yeah, hello. I don't know. Can you hear me, please? Sorry, my background is a bit noisy. Yeah, you in one of your slides. I mean, during the presentation, there was a, what do you call it? A caption: "Who can apply?" And then there were 4.
That one.
Oh, these ones.
Yeah, that you raised. So perhaps I might have.
So we would need the applicant needs to have a existing heat network, either a district heat network or a communal heat network. That needs to be existing. It can't be a to be built heat network. It has to be in England or Wales. It has to be the application has to be from the person that has the can sign off on investment decisions, can make funding decisions on behalf of the heat network. And then in terms of applicants, it can be anyone, public sector, private sector, third sector. So those are the kind of the criteria that you would have to meet.
All right, thanks.
Fab, thank you for your question. And then we had a question around applying in rounds 4 or 5, with most of the work expecting in the next financial year. Is that okay? Yes, it is. You don't have to apply for funding in this financial year and next financial year. We do still have capital funding available in this financial year. So we're really keen to hear any projects that think they would be able to spend capital funding in this financial year, so before the end of March. And again, typically this would be looking at people that are, I guess, buying kit, potentially they could do upfront, and then they could use their match funding to pay for the installation, which could go past the end of March 2024. So the project itself doesn't need to complete by the end of March 2024. You just need to draw down however much you've asked for in this financial year by that date. And in order for us to pay out any grant funding, you have to, if you're not a local authority organisation, you have to demonstrate that you have spent the money before we will pay out the funding. So it's a retrospective grant. It's not an upfront grant. So if you're able to submit, for example, a copy of an invoice for something that you've bought or some work that's been done, then based on that invoice, we'll then be able to issue you the grant money. So that's something to bear in mind as well. But yeah, that money would need to be spent and evidenced to spent by the end of that funding round, by the end of that financial year. But if you're applying in round 4 or 5 and you just want funding in the next financial year, so from April onwards, then that's also fine. You don't have to apply for funding in this financial year as well. Question from Sandra.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to see if it was easier for you if I read them out. So can you elaborate on exactly what is funded under capital grants 0.4 and metering?
Yes. So again, this is all included in our guidance document. So again, I'd recommend you have a look there. But in terms of the sort of some examples, so sub-metering, if you're going into a greater level of metering than is legally required. So particularly sub-metering on particular areas, for example. If you've had a metering and billing regulation assessment, a cost-effective assessment, and that's come back and said it's negative, it's not worth you installing, then essentially you've kind of met your legal requirement. But if you still wanted to go ahead and install the meters anyway, then maybe we could fund those, or also looking at kind of more smarter solutions, where you can have sort of displays for operators and things like that, that can give a bit more detail on what's happening with the network. So it's kind of anything that goes above and beyond the legal requirements in the heat metering billing regulations. Hopefully that answers the question, Sandra.
Another question, could additional heat generation sources be funded? For example, the addition of electric boilers to supplement gas-fired CHP and aid decarbonisation?
No, unfortunately not, because that's essentially, although it's not directly replacing primary plants, the idea would be if it was additional boilers, then it would be still generating over the other boilers. So so no, anything that's installing anything to do with heat generation is not eligible under HNES, unfortunately. Everything around it is, but the actual replacement of generation is not, unfortunately.
I'm flicking through, but I think that you have answered the rest of them, Louise. You're too fast.
Yeah, I can't see any more. So yeah, if anyone's got any further questions, feel free to either put them in the chat, or feel free to come off mic or off mute and speak to us directly if you want.
I've just put that slide back there as well, so the email address is visible as well. If you ever have any questions, as I said, general inquiries, pop them through to the HNES@gemserve.com for anything about your project application specifically, then you can speak to a relationship manager.